I rongo au, I tetehi harikoa nā te mea he kura tēnei. So I rongo au I te katakata me te harikoa o ngā tamariki, I te wā I hikoi ana. The reason I wanted to start with that, one is Leonie said I got an hour to speak, and that's quite a long time. So 15 minutes in, ka pai tātou. But also is to walk the walk. And what I want to explore and think about are what are our ecosystems of emotion. How do we, as tangata, connect to our taiao, to our whenua, in ways that support our emotional well-being, but also the reciprocity for the well-being of our whenua and our taiao. So I want to kind of posit the idea that we are part of that ecosystem. And we say that all the time. Ko au te awa, ko te awa, ko au. Ko au te maunga, ko te maunga, ko au. We talk about our whakapapa relationships to whenua, to taiao, all the time. We claim whenua and taiao in our pepeha. So what does it mean if we then understand ngā kare-ā-roto within each of us, individually and collectively, as intimately connected with that of our whenua? That's the kōrero I want to kind of tease out. This is very early thinking, and it's somewhat a love letter to our Indigenous botanist, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, because her work, braiding sweetgrass, gathering moss, and the serviceberry are some of the most potent pieces of writing that connect the physical and spiritual and story elements of our taiao to us as people. So if you haven't read her work yet, this is a bit of a love letter to her. And I want to explore what that means ki konei. When I was driving here from Tūranganui-a-Kiwa last night, I had my 2-year-old in the back. We do the trip quite a bit, so he's a pretty seasoned traveller. But we got from Whakatāne to Tauranga, it was about 7 p.m, and he was over it. And I was trying to go through my head, the presentation, what am I going to talk about? How do I tease this out? How do I get clarity on this? And all he wanted to do was sing songs, the same song, over and over and over, as only a 2-year-old can do. So, tirama ngā whetū was it, because he could see ngā whetū. It was a beautiful clear sky, he could see the marama. And so I sung it on autopilot, at the same time trying to drive, and at the same time trying to think about this kōrero today. And I kept going over, and he'd go, anō, anō. And I'd try and sing another song, and he'd go, ngā whetū, anō, anō. Okay, autopilot, autopilot. So for a whole hour, tirama ngā whetū, kei te pēhea rā koutou, kei te pēhea rā koutou, kei te pēhea rā koutou. At first, I kind of thought of the interesting translation from the English to kei te pēhea rā koutou, and then it dropped. Do we ever actually ask kei te pēhea rā koutou of our taiao, of our whetū? Rangi does. Rangi asks how the whetū are all the time. But do we ever stop and ask kei te pēhea koutou, kei te pēhea tō awa, e pēhea ana tō maunga, tō whenua, tō ukaipo? So I start with that. And then I go back to thinking about my experience as a child. We lived in Opotiki, so we drove Opotiki to Putaruru fairly regularly, often at night. And my dad would always say to me, the moon will follow us home. No matter where you look, the moon will follow us home. And I remember maybe being 8 or 9, drifting in and out of sleep in the car on the long drive. I'd always open my eyes and the moon would be right there. No matter the angle we were travelling, the moon was right there. And I was grateful to Hina for following us home and keeping us safe. I grew up in my mother's garden. She was an avid gardener, and my grandparents' garden before that. And I think it was there that I felt the full spectrum of what it means to be in relationship with our taiao. The joy of eating raspberries straight from Papa's vines, even though we weren't supposed to. And then the magic of seeing those raspberries turned into the sweetest raspberry jam on Nana's table. The boredom as I followed Mum as she spent hours with her herbs that would later appear in teas when we got sick or slapped on us if we got a cut. I experienced deceit when I trusted my brother, when he told me to pick a handful of a plant for Mum, only to learn it was stinging nettle. And then I felt my cheeks burning almost as much as my hand with the whakamā that I had believed him. I felt the disgust at the compost bin smell and hated the job of taking the food scraps out. But I remember Mum saying, if you do nothing else, just make soil. Take your waste and make soil. I'm not doing this very well. What I didn't understand is that the whenua, the taiao, and those closest to it at that point in my life were teaching me about transformation, about our emotions, and how our emotional landscapes are always there for us and with us. I moved into working in the taiao space. I was an environmental planner and geographer by training. And I remember my first job as a graduate planner making decisions about the environment from policies in ring binders. Policies that not once mentioned papatuanuku, and I felt deep frustration and disconnection. Many years later, we were able to design a freshwater monitoring framework for our iwi. We took kaumātua and kuia to visit one of the, what I would say, Aotearoa's cleanest, most pristine puna. When we were there, one of our kuia wept and wept. We were asking the group of kaumātua and kuia to give us their assessment. Hea te oranga o tēnei wai. By every scientific standard, this body of water would have measured with some of the best in the world. And this kuia rated it as one of the lowest. Her reasoning, this was the first time in her 75 years that she had met this wai. She said that the water was sad and that it missed its people. How do you explain that to a freshwater scientist or to the council and their policies and ring binders? How do you translate the language of grief between species, between taiao and tangata, the way that land and people can actually ache for each other across decades of separation? In another workshop with the Ministry for the Environment, we were asked to define indicators of environmental well-being. A kuia simply said, I'll know that our awa is well when I can hear the laughter of my mokopuna playing in it. The statistician in the room said, we can't write that down, you can't measure that, it's not an indicator. I felt the anger of awa too, when water companies tried to bottle the last of our puna and export it. A river that I'd always known as still and beautiful suddenly seemed to roar with rapids of anger that I'd never seen before. It was angry, or maybe I was angry. I named my daughter after that awa, not after the anger, but after the beauty to that awa holds, so that we never forget what we are charged with protecting. I felt the deep grief of standing at our pā site after it was irreparably damaged by quarrying. 14 years we warned them and begged them to stop. When I arrived to see a third of the pā collapsed into the quarry, the karanga that came from me was one I'd only ever heard at Tangihana. And it wasn't just my grief, it was the grief of the hapu and the land itself. But I've also felt the healing power of our places. Walking to ancestral sites on a 23-day hikoi, retracing the footsteps of Mahinarangi, my body was sore. I had blistered feet, my legs were aching, my back was sore, but I had a lightness that I had never felt before. My heart was full of clarity and purpose, and I was being pulled by something much deeper than myself. I share these experiences to illustrate something that I think is fundamental about our environmental knowledge as Indigenous people and as Māori. Our emotions are not internal psychological states of individuals waiting to be managed. They are relational phenomena that emerge through our connections with our taiao, with our whenua, with each other. Western psychology tends to position emotions as private, individual experiences requiring regulation. We know and understand them as conversations between ourselves, our places, and our communities. I'm sure that you can all think back to your own childhood and think of places where you first felt certain emotions. What emotions grew from those places for you? When we understand that our emotions emerge through relationship with place, then we can begin to see the land not merely as a physical environment, but as a teacher and as a guide. Lots of the interviewees that I spoke with in this rangahau spoke about the profound connection between our inner ecosystems, our inner landscapes, and the outer landscapes. One kōrero that was shared is that ngā Kare-ā-roto are a direct reflection of the taiao. That's happening above in the heavens, on earth, out in the taiao that surrounds us, and that we are part of that. We cannot disconnect from it. We are it. Another wahine shared, she said, the biggest one for me has actually been the way the taiao has reflected particular feelings, but also the way that it's held me in my own emotions. She says, I think of Papa Tuanuku, and if I describe the spaces that she has, her caves, for example, the cold, dark, te pō-like spaces, I feel comforted there. I equally feel comforted sitting in the kind of beautiful red kokowai earthiness that feels grounding and familiar. These kinds of kōrero, I think, reveal a profound shift from this focus on emotions as internal, private experiences, but more so about the relationship between ourself and the environment. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in this work and in thinking about that relationship is what do we offer back to our taiao? There is a risk, I think, that we sit in a space when we think about the way that the taiao can mirror, reflect, hold, regulate our emotions, that we become extractive of that power. If we think about it as a relationship, what is it that we offer back to the whenua and taiao to ensure its healing as well? A lot of the kai kōrero that we spoke to talked about the power of being on the whenua, of being with the whenua. And one of the things that they talked a lot about was the ability to be. Just be. That the whenua knew no judgment of what they might be going through or what they were holding in that particular moment. That the atua that are embodied or that embody different parts of the taiao weren't there to judge or place moral judgment or value on the particular things that they were feeling, but they were there to hold, to be in conversation and relationship. When we are on our whenua, this wahine says, you literally can feel the energy, the cyclic sharing of mauri. That's what happens with Papa Tuanuku. The only thing is we don't have to perform. We just have to stand and be. Emotions are inconvenient in the current world that we live in. I don't know how many times I've heard myself, my sister, I don't have time to be sad about that. I don't have time to be diddy about that. Oh, it's a hoha to feel that way. I'll just carry on. Emotions are highly inconvenient in the world that we live in. But that doesn't mean that emotions are the problem. It means that the world that we live in, the attention economy, our capitalist society, where everything needs to be channeled into some kind of productivity, problematises our kare-ā-roto. And actually, one of the issues that we and our whenua have, and Leonie talked about it, is our unresolved emotions. When we don't allow those kare-ā-roto to ripple, that is when we start to see issues. When our whenua isn't allowed to grieve, or we're not allowed to grieve what has been lost or polluted or damaged, then that's when it's passed through generations. I keep going back to my 2-year-old because, you know, the life of a 2-year-old is ever present. Our babies know how to feel their emotions instinctively. And when they do, they move through those emotional states incredibly quickly. Right? A 2-year-old tantrum at the supermarket, if you let it pass, passes quickly. And then they're on to the next thing. Kei konei te harikoa, kei konei te hikaka, kei konei te ngā mea katoa. It's when we don't let those things ripple out of us or through us, and same with our whenua, that I think we start to see more of the challenges. I'm drawn also to some of the work that started to come out by the likes of Hana Tapiata with her book Atua Wahine, which prompts us to think about how we're in conversation with our taiao, with our atua, with ourselves. I'm also have been inspired by Kristen Ross's work, The Māori Perfectionist, again around prompting what this means, not from a Western self-care perspective, but from a deeply Māori relational way of being. Hana Tapiata says, sometimes when we feel overwhelmed by life's pressures, we can reframe that using a te ao Māori perspective, by connecting or reconnecting with our mātauranga. We might feel like we've found ourselves in a dark place, uncertain, unsettled and isolated, buried by the weight and pressures of life, or instead, we might feel that we have been planted. And I share that particular kōrero because I remember in my own lived experience not knowing what to do with emotions that I thought were negative, right? Attributed negative things to them. Shame, embarrassment, whakamā, all of these emotions that have been framed in a te ao Pākehā perspective as negative. And my pull at that time was to the ngahere. And I remember thinking, I just want to go and lie in the moss and I just want it to grow over the top of me. And I thought that was a really bad thing. I thought that was a really, really negative thing. I was like, oh, I'm on the precipice here, like I need to go and see a psychologist. And when I moved through that state of te pō and I reflected on it, I had a yearning to sit in the comfort of our ngahere. Wasn't forever. Moss is lovely. It's soft, it's comforting, it's connected, it's hidden, but to be comforted by our taiao. And we can find that in our everyday spaces. Leonie talked about the importance of te reo. And I think one of the most important things in thinking about our ecosystems of emotions is the reclamation of our reo. Our reo, our whakatauki, tell us the vital importance of our whenua and our taiao to understanding our own well-being. A tinana, a wairua, a hinengaro. These are living connections. We talk about the taiao as our whanaunga, and so when we recognise them as relational, we treat that relationship differently. When they are not a it, but when they are kin, it's no wonder that we shape them and they shape us just like we do our own whānau. Our reo, our kupu, the way we talk about our emotions, the way we talk about taiao and our bodies, it's not accidental. This is a sophisticated body of knowledge and practice. One of the kai kōrero that I spoke to talked more about whatumanawa, about mōhiotanga, about māramatanga, as the way that he understood emotions, more so than Kare-ā-roto. Puku mā Tauranga. We talk about our bodies as part of the environment, so it makes sense that there are ecosystems inside of us giving us tohu, warnings, warm feelings, what is it, red flags, green flags, all of the flags. It's not just poetry, it's not just metaphor, it's instruction. It's emotional maps that guide us. Our reo provides that, our whakapapa provides that, our taiao provides that for us. Robin Wall-Kimmerer speaks about this as the grammar of animacy. How for her, trees, rivers and rocks are relatives, they have personhood. She says that in some native languages the term for plants translates to those who take care of us. Know the ways of the one who take care of you, she said, so that you may take care of them. Again, it's the reciprocity between ourselves and the whenua and taiao that is the key here. Our language doesn't separate us from the world. It constantly reminds us that we belong to it. It reminds us that our bodies, our feelings, our thoughts are all speaking to each other all of the time, and that our job is to listen, to feel, and to respond. Again, highly inconvenient in the current world that we live in, but how many of us can listen, can feel, can take the time out to ride the emotional wave with the 2-year-old when you're trying to cook the dinner on a Zoom call, thinking about what next. To be able to listen, to feel, to be in relationship with our taiao, with our whenua, with ourselves, requires time sovereignty, requires reclamation of māramataka. And I've heard Rangi talk about this before, not as an overlay, as another thing on top of the Gregorian calendar, so that you go, oh God, now I've got this calendar, and I've got a this, and a this, and a this, right? But actually as a stripping away of all of that. Our bodies often know things before we do. Again, we're quite good at silencing that, pushing that to the side, not hearing the flags, the signals, the warning signs, or swallowing it down. One of the kai kōrero, and actually I think nearly all of the kai kōrero that I have spoken with have talked about their puku at the heart of their emotional experience. Very few people have talked about their heart. They've talked about the puku knowing. You know, noho puku. She says, one way that I noticed that helps me tell the difference between puku knowledge, tell the difference is that puku knowledge is not debatable. It just is. Whereas my puku isn't really coming with words and stuff, it's coming with sensation. We talk ourselves out of that puku knowledge all of the time. Another wahine said, my body actually knows what I'm feeling before my mind does. My puku feels it first, and I've had to relearn how to trust that embodied way of knowing. One of the participants makes the distinction between anxiety and knowledge, which I think is significant. She talks about the puku knowledge as knowledge, whereas Western ways and Western psychology might pathologize it as anxiety. She reframes it as intelligence, the body's capacity to read cues that conscious awareness hasn't yet identified. Another wahine talked about her experience with ADHD. And actually she had a kupu for ADHD, roto te reo, and I don't have it on me. But she talked a lot about that and about the ways in which Western societies reframe that particular way of being, again, as something to be managed, to be regulated, to be medicated, as opposed to the superpower that she understood that particular momo to be. One of the ways that a lot of the kai kōrero talked about and that I've been thinking about a lot is how we engage in ceremony and reconnection with our taiao as a form of emotional well-being, as a form of emotional regulation and emotional support. So hikoi for me has been my jam. It's been the thing that has supported my own understanding of emotions for myself, but also in a collective sense and in relationship with the taiao. When we walked for 23 days, we had ritual every day that connected us with the places we were walking. At the end of that hikoi, a few people said, "How was your hike? How was your tramp?" And I was like, "I didn't do a tramp. I did a hikoi." They said, "Oh yeah, but it's like a tramp." And I said, "Kyle, hikoi is not tramping. I don't even think walking is the correct way to describe what we do when we hikoi. We know it's political. We have employed hikoi as political action for generations. But that's not just about taking a visible stand. That is about collectively moving through our experiences of riri. It is about collectively moving through our experiences of mamai together. Hikoi as an individual is never just about us as an individual. And actually, one of the things I learned on our hikoi is if you are in that frame of mind, the taiao will trip you up pretty quickly. Like quite literally, trip you up pretty quickly. You will be reminded of the awareness and attention that is required to be in ceremony with the whenua and the taiao. Our ancestors understood something very profound about the physics of emotions. How feelings need pathways to flow, how healing happens through resonance and vibration, through sound, through ngā ihi rangaranga, through oro. They had sophisticated technologies that they had developed to understand, express, and regulate their emotions. Karanga, motiatia, haka. These weren't just about the individual, but they flowed outwards into community healing as well. Sound travels. It moves through air, through water, through bone, through earth. Our ancestors knew this. Lots of the wahine that I spoke to also talked about karanga, particularly tangi apakura. The karanga, the wailing that you hear at tangi, or that was heard, sometimes still heard. About the vibrational space, the use of vibration and of karanga. And one wahine likened it to the sounds of labour. Again, I think a really interesting thing to explore. One wahine said, "Karanga connects me to emotions that I didn't know I had. In moments of deep wairua connection, a voice comes out of me that I don't recognise. Yes, it's grief, but it's also love. And it's connection to our tupuna and our whenua all at once." It's the other thing that's come through a lot of the kōrero is we can hold multiple emotions. Our taiao can hold multiple emotions. Our marae are prime examples of being able to hold a multitude of emotions that if you were looking from the outside would seem kind of bizarre. The laughter at tangihana is almost heard as much as the crying at tangihana. Right? The healing power of laughter. I'm going to go back to that other slide in a minute. One of the things that a lot of the kai kōrero talked about were all of the different technologies that we have available to us to support healthy emotional expression, and that nearly all of these are connected to our taiao in some way, that require an awareness and an attention to our whenua and our taiao. One tāne talked about karakia as the Swiss Army knife of te ao Māori. I thought that was kind of funny, but you know, it is that thing that we have at our disposal. Ia ahakoa te kaupapa. We have karakia, a Swiss Army knife. Others talked about mō tia, about karanga. Another wahine talked about being out in the environment and just letting the rain wash away anything she was feeling. Pure. The ability for us to pure, to be in water, to use wai, makes sense when you think about what Leonie's talked about in terms of our kupu around Kare-ā-roto. But one of the things that colonisation has done, and I've got my slides out of order, but one of the wahine that I spoke to said one of the biggest instruments of colonialism is hyper-individualism. Whereas in te ao Māori we move together, not just people together, but taiao, whenua, taha wairua, past, future. It all collapses in on each other. Colonial language sees the land as commodity, not as our relations. Colonisation didn't just steal land. It fragmented the emotional ecosystems that have kept our communities whole. It privatised land and it privatised our emotions. It made them individual problems, just like it made individual parcels of land that could be owned. So when we think about reclamation of our emotional well-being and restoration of our kare-ā-roto, we need to think about restoration of our whenua and our taiao. We need to think about restoration of our language, and we need to think about restoration of our time. If we don't have sovereignty over our time, this mama says, we don't have sovereignty over our emotions. It is essential to be able to process and feel our emotions, and colonisation has disconnected us from that. It's also disconnected us from the ability to feel love and be loved, and to connect to aroha. Me aro ki te hā o hine ahuone. Aroha comes from our whenua, comes from hine ahuone. Leanne Birasamoke Samosake Simpson is another, I'm a bit of a fangirl of hers as well, another incredible Anishinaabe author, and she talks a lot about the kind of politics of reclamation. But she says the skill set you need to survive is not the same skill set that you need to love and be loved. And so many of our whānau are forced to sit in spaces of survival that actually the experience and skills to feel aroha, they're distracted from the ability to sit in their aroha because they are preoccupied and distracted with trying to survive. Layered onto all of that then comes all of the ways that we try to numb all of those feelings, which I won't go into. But as I said before, I think the reciprocity piece is really important. Because colonialism taught us to compartmentalise, right? Separate the mind from the body, separate the people from the whenua, separate the people from the language, separate your emotions. So stitching all of those parts back together is really important, but in a way that offers something back. So that the koha of aroha that comes from the whenua flows through us and we don't accumulate it. We don't accumulate this abundance that we never share. We are in an interesting time of wellness culture, very individualistic wellness culture, which again can appear positive at first glance, but actually still can reinforce the very disconnection that harms collective healing. So what does it mean then to have collective emotional well-being? That we're not just self-caring our individual selves, almost to disconnection. That we can sit in community in ways that feel cup-filling, that don't feel extractive, that don't feel like they all fall on the shoulders of one or two people. That you can step in and out of kaupapa without feeling like your kaupapa are all going to fall apart. I want to finish by talking a little bit about joy. Because as Leonie said, I think in nearly all of the interviews that I spoke to, people went straight to mamai, pauri, grief, as when they talked about their emotions. Or they started with a kōrero about feeling depressed or anxious, which are all, parts of the emotional ecosystem that we live in. But not many talked about joy, about te hare me te koa, about all of the suite of emotions that make them feel tau, make them feel safe, make them feel cared for. I recently finished a kaupapa with the Mana Wahine claim, which was talking to wahine who work in the taiao space, everyone from policy people to rongoa, whole range of wahine who work in the taiao space. And the last question we asked them was, what do you need? And the mahi that you do, what do you need? And, had the expectation that they'd say, we need more resources, we need more people to be in this space, we need the government to get out of the way, we need, all of these amazing things which they had talked about through their interviews. And the resounding reply was, we need rest, restoration, and spaces of joy. They said, we are exhausted. In their fights for the whenua, in the protection work that they're doing, there was nothing for them in terms of, not nothing, but there was very little space for them to feel joy, to feel restored in their work. Again, Leanne Simpson says joy is a practice. It's not just an individual emotion. It's a practice of remembering how deeply we are connected to each other and to the land. And so in thinking about emotional ecosystems or future-facing pathways, the question is, how do we reweave that ancient intelligence that sits in our taiao, that sits in our whakapapa, that sits in our tinana, with the kinds of contemporary realities that our whānau have, so that we have emotional flourishing. One of the participants, Kai Kōrero, that we spoke to, she said it doesn't all look the same. It doesn't have to. Actually, all of it is important. And she says there's not one atua whose expression is more important than the other atua. Similarly, if we think about our taiao, diversity is what makes a healthy and strong taiao. Right from the microbes that sit in our soil and the mycelium, mushroom tendril things that speak to each other through the whenua, a diverse ngahere that has multiple canopies. Diversity is the example. Yet we often in our reclamation journeys try to narrow that reclamation into one way of looking or being as authentic. One of the Kai Kōrero talked about the recent hikoi, and she said exactly that. The hikoi is about emotional solidarity, and walking the whenua together is like a forest root system. We were able to send energy to each other and carry those emotions collectively. Robin Wall-Kimmerer says that trees don't act as individuals. Somehow they manage to act as collectives. She says in a scientific term, they don't really know how that happens yet, but they see the hua of that, the power of unity. What happens to one happens to us all. I won't talk about, there's a whole lot of kōrero around grief and collective grief for our whenua, and I think I've touched enough on it. But I do want to come back to the reclamation piece. And I think when we engage in restoration, whether that's restoration of our language, of our land, or of ourselves and our communities, we are sending that restoration out in our ecosystems when we are connected. Like Mum in her garden and our ancestors before her, we're learning to make soil from what seems like waste. We're remembering that our emotions, all of them are sacred technologies, ways that connect us to each other and to the living world. I don't think the path forward is always about perfecting our emotional regulation. This isn't about not experiencing emotions, quite the opposite. It's about understanding how our experience of emotions impacts all of those around us, including our whenua and taiao, and vice versa. Whiti Hireaka has a new book, which I, again, highly recommend, which really helped my thinking around this. She said, ahead are the mountains and lake. You used to think of them as yours, and they are, but that doesn't fully describe your relationship. These mountains knew you for generations before you arrived. They have watched your line grow. You are equally theirs. They lay claim to you as much as you lay claim to them. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Kia ora.